Hello and welcome back to Cinema 130, Film Appreciation. Today we're continuing our discussion of story. We're going to get into themes, conflicts and goals, also tone, and then move on to dialogue and script writing. So let's get started. I'm going to share my screen and we will be in business. Okay, so today we're talking about story, or continuing our discussion of story. A few reminders. Homework 2 from our first, or rather our second week is due. You have a quiz next week, so please do study. There's a quiz review in this week's module. Open your book and follow along with the page numbers in the corner. We are in week 3, everybody. And we have our case study 1 coming up and on adaptation, and I'll give you some prep next week. Okay, let's get into it. So you've seen this before, but I'll say it again. Evidence strongly suggests that humans in all cultures come to cast their own identity in some sort of narrative form. We are inherent storytellers and story watchers. We love stories. We love listening and watching movies and television shows and kind of seeing things work out in this insignificant world, sometimes when things don't work out in ours. So here we have heroes, and we see different types of heroes, and this tells us a lot about what we like about movies. Of course, there are superheroes, and they've come to dominate cinema in the last decade, but there's many different types of heroes in the world. Let's look at some types. So we have the superhero, someone who possesses special powers, virtuous hero, everyman hero, tragic hero, reluctant hero, unlikely hero, anti-heroes. So with all these, you want to drop any notion of good and evil with heroes. Protagonists can be good, evil, or in between. So let's get into it. So we have superheroes, of course. We know Superman. He has superhuman abilities, but James Bond is a superhero of sorts. So is Neo from Matrix, because they have extra human abilities. They can't be killed. They never fail in the end. They are superhuman in some way. The virtuous hero is someone who always does the right thing. So we have examples here. Ted Lasso from the television series and these various characters from movies that you may have seen. They always choose the virtuous right thing to do, even if it hurts them or goes against common wisdom or law. Then we have the unlikely hero, often a small nerd type character or someone who just doesn't seem heroic. They aren't special in some way. They aren't strong and big, and they become the role of the hero. So we have Frodo from Lord of the Rings, a lot of characters that Michael Cera plays, including in Juno and in Scott Pilgrim. Then we move on to the everyman hero. So this is a working class guy like Bruce Willis in Die Hard, who looks and feels like just the average guy. Not the smartest, not the biggest, but they're tough and they persevere in the end. Hawkeye is the everyman hero in the Avengers. He doesn't have superpowers. Okay, he's just good with a bow and arrow. Guess they didn't have guns where he grew up. So the reluctant hero is someone who doesn't want to be a hero. Maybe they have moral failings or they just are insecure. And we see the examples of that with Neo and Han Solo. The everyman hero is an ordinary guy, isn't always the smartest or strongest who becomes the hero. And the reason this works is the audience can very much relate to this character. Often we see cops or detectives, average guy heroes in movies because the audience finds them identifiable. The unlikely hero is also identifiable. Okay, so he's not the smartest or the strongest, but there's something special about him, or he just will persevere. Sometimes he's a social outcast or from a different race or religion. Harry Potter or any sort of small guy who comes to succeed in the end could be an unlikely hero. They don't have obvious heroic qualities. Now, the anti-hero is very unique and special and very popular today. A lot of films and television shows have anti-heroes. They're flawed and sometimes they're just outright criminals, but keep in mind, anti-heroes are not the villain, okay? They're not evil. They're most often the heroes, hence the name anti-heroes, the protagonists of the story, and we're going to follow their decisions, but they may have moral failings or be a criminal. They could be a criminal with a great heart, or they could be just someone who doesn't live up to heroic standards. So Harley Quinn, She kills people, but we love her. The Joker, homicidal, but entertaining. Then we have likable. Here's an example of a likable anti-hero in Johnny Depp's Captain Jack. He's fun-loving, and he's going against a bunch of stooges who are kind of the antagonists of the film. So we have likable and unlikable. Walt grows to be unlikable in Breaking Bad. But anti-heroes are very popular. It's someone totally ill fit to be in the role, but must don the mantle of the hero because of circumstance or perhaps some change of heart on them. They could be greedy, they could be ruthless, or just simply selfish. Okay, they're not virtuous, they aren't heroic, they aren't putting others in front of themselves, which a hero does. But they also make very interesting characters. Okay, and they're complex and they say and do fun things. So this is why they're so popular today. I just want to quickly mention too, you have comedic and tragic heroes. In a comedy, very often the heroes are unlikely. Okay, they're not the guy you would think is heroic, and that's why it's a comedy. Okay, and you have tragic heroes that we know are going to die in the film. Okay, and their end is sort of foreshadowed, and they're a tragic hero, and they're not going to succeed, or they will succeed but die in the end. Okay, this takes us to goals and conflict. Okay, what is the protagonist trying to achieve? What must they overcome? Films must have goals and must have conflicts. There are exceptions, of course, but most films need something for the protagonist to achieve to keep the attention of the audience. So goals and conflicts. Characters have goals, okay? Conflict results in pursuit of those goals. Goals come from the desire and circumstance of the character, and often they mirror the desires of the audience to succeed, to fall in love. So let's take a look. Here's an example from Jaws, 1976. The antagonist, okay, goal, kill human. Protagonist, goal, kill shark. Conflict, they got to survive. Who's going to survive this conflict, okay? In literature, conflict is a clash between two opposing forces that creates the narrative thread of the story. That's why they're important. That's why we pay attention for 2 hours. In Hollywood films, especially genre movies, if you like those, emphasize goals. The average audience member goes to a crime movie wondering how the protagonist will solve the crime. And you go to a horror film to see what the monster is going to look like, but also how the last character is going to survive the monster. Okay. Goals are important in genre films. The character must have wants and needs. So, 2 different types of goals, external and internal. An external goal is a goal a character shows to the world, okay? And most movies focus on external goals. They're the easiest to spot. So we have winning the trophy, winning the prize, falling in love, getting money. Those are the obvious ones. But internal goals are personal, and they're known only to the character, but they're revealed through their actions. It might be to overcome personal odds, to prove self-worth, to become a hero, to feel loved, okay? Let's focus here for a second on external goals. So there could be the physical object, which is, by the way, hero goes on a journey, friends and family. Trouble comes to town. You've got to protect your friends and family. The destination, the achievement. These are all hero goes on a journey. These different goals that characters have that's going to take them away from their comfort zone and on a journey. Stop the madness. So some bad thing happens or there's a monster. We call this, of course, trouble comes to town, and you've got to deal with it. And this leads to this idea of story arcs. In other words, a character starts in one place. We call that equilibrium. And they end up in another place, okay, at the end of the story. They've grown, they've changed. So here in the example, rags to riches, the character is going to start low in rags and whoop, go up to riches. Riches to rags is the opposite. This is like a tragedy. They start high and end up low. And famously in Cinderella, she starts in a low place, goes on an adventure in a high place, but then ends up back where she was, and then by the end is restored. Okay, so movies have a story arc. The audience goes on a journey with the characters through their triumphs and their tragedies. Okay, and this is what creates conflict. This is why we need it. We need them to overcome something, and we call this a character arc. The character arc is the transformation or inner journey a character goes over in the course of a story. They begin as one sort of person, and they gradually transform into a different person in response to changing developments. They have to adapt. And dynamic characters, we talked about those last week. Those characters have character arcs. Static characters usually don't. They're static. They don't change. Dynamic characters change. So in a movie, you have a story arc, which mirrors the main character arc, but then you also might have subplots that are going on. A romantic subplot gets resolved earlier or later in the story, but the main character arc is the journey the character goes on. So they start as one type of person, okay, usually selfish in some way. They go through some sort of change through the journey, rising to the climax of the story, through rising action to the climax. And then in the resolution, they end up as a different person. This is a basic character arc you'll see in many, many movies. Here's an example of Woody's character arc in Toy Story. Very much the Cinderella character arc. A franchise over many different movies can have a franchise character arc. So for example, here with Harry Potter, we've seen these kids grow up. They started out as kids, grew through puberty, and then went into high school. I believe they were in their 20s when they were playing the kids by the end. So we've seen them grow and change, and their franchise story arc has grown and changed. So this leads us to the conversation about types of conflict. So we have internal and we have external. All right. So internal is going to be human versus self. And this connects with internal goals. If you have internal goals, you have internal conflict. And by the way, we're on page 16, as you'll note there. Internal goals leads to internal conflicts. You want things, and so it's going to be a challenge to go and get them. You're going to have to improve in some way. Okay. We also have external goals, human versus society, human versus nature, human versus technology, and human versus supernatural. So let's get into this. First off, human versus self, okay? Internal conflict. Most movies have at their root human versus self, okay? There's some sort of internal struggle that you're going through, some way that you're going to have to change or improve to succeed in the end. The protagonists have to overcome their own fears or artificial boundaries to succeed. They might be fine. They might not need to improve, but they have some sort of insecurity that they must get past. Even films with strong conflicts between two humans will also have a bit of internal struggle. Okay, so types of conflict, getting into this, all right? So we have person versus person. All right, we've covered that one. All right, that's internal conflict. But the rest of these are external. So person versus nature. So, when you have to go up against a storm or, some external force, it could even be God that in the film that the humans are up against. Person versus person versus person, rather, would be an example of human versus human. And we see this most common in films. This is where two protagonists has to go up against the antagonist. This is going to be all superhero films. Person versus society. There's some sort of impressive society, which may not be manifest in a single person, but there's an oppressive force. It could be a school, a prison. Prison films are human versus society, human versus system. Person versus technology is going to be man versus machine. So any kind of sci-fi film often, or any film where the machines are in conflict with the humans. And then you have person versus supernatural. That's going to be expressed in horror films, okay? Where you're going up against some supernatural force, very common in horror. And just to clarify again, person versus self is internal conflict. That's where you have to battle your own demons to succeed. So to clarify, internal versus external. Internal conflict, we're talking about Batman here. So Bruce Wayne has internal conflicts within his character. He has self-doubt. He doesn't know if he should be the Batman. He's all hung up on his parents' death. He also has external conflicts. He has conflicts with other characters like the Joker. But he also has conflicts with the system and the society, the corruption of Gotham City, the corruption within the police force, and the crime-ridden city in general. So internal and external conflicts. Human versus human, one of the most common conflicts. You have hero versus villain, good versus evil, us versus them. And you see this a lot in superhero, fantasy, sci-fi, Western. Almost all action films are going to have a direct conflict. But let's get into some other types of examples. So Perfect Storm, might not have seen it, but guess what? It's human versus nature. It's the storm that's the antagonist. Punch Drunk Love is a romance, and it's human versus self, because it's an internal struggle that the character must overcome. Nightmare on Elm Street, what do you think? Human versus supernatural force. Terminator 2, very obviously human versus technology. Okay. How about Batman versus Superman? Pretty obviously human versus human, or actually superhuman versus human, excuse me. But even within that film, there's internal conflicts that both characters are dealing with, as well as facing off against each other. Breakfast Club. Okay, you have a little bit of human versus human. You, of course, have human versus self. They're struggling with their own internal doubts and insecurities. But you also have human versus system, the school. Okay, the oppressive system of the detention. Now, that's expressed in another human, which is the vice principal in that film. So it's human versus him, but it's also human versus system. And that's the same is true for Get Out. You have both a conflict with humans, but you also have a conflict with the system. Here's some other examples. Take a look at these. You might know some of these films or television shows and think about what the conflicts are in those. So a word about endings, then the way films end. Most films meet expectations. The characters achieve goals, but some films will defeat expectations. They'll have a twist ending, or the character won't quite succeed or will perish in the end. So happy endings. Most films have a happy ending. That's the Hollywood standard. Remember we talked about that. That's classic Hollywood style. The protagonist's goals are achieved. The antagonist is defeated, if there is one. Equilibrium is restored with the character in a new place. Okay, pretty simple. Romantic subplot, two characters fall in love. Okay, that's a happy ending. But then you have many different types of other endings that aren't necessarily sad endings, but they're a twist ending. Some films seek to surprise the audience by defeating expectations in some way. The protagonist fails or dies while succeeding. The audience expectations are not met, and they might be shocked or excited. It might really give them a whole different perspective. Twist endings are very memorable, but sometimes they're best on the first viewing. So, moving on to themes. What are the underlying messages and ideas conveyed in the story? Okay, theme is very, very important, but it's subtle. The story are what happens to the characters through the journey, but the themes are the ideas and the morals that are conveyed subtly through the events of the story and the choices made by the protagonist. Let's take a look. So, theme can have many meanings. The subject of a piece of writing, the moral of the story, ethical issues explored in the story, reoccurring idea pervasive in the film. So if it's a film about man versus machine and they're always battling technology, one of the themes there is going to be the pervasive and danger of technology. So here's some common themes. We have ultimately a search for identity is one of the most common themes, but you know these: good versus evil, love conquers all, triumph over adversity. Now, in horror films, you often see the world as a dangerous place. And another common theme, coming of age stories, where a young person grows up, maybe a teen or even younger. They go through adversity, they overcome insecurity, and they mature right in front of our eyes. And there's many different types of themes: survival, justice, redemption, vengeance. So to select a couple common genres, in superhero films, you'll see good versus evil, obviously, but also there'll be other lesser themes like friendship and teamwork. Almost all superhero films will touch on that. Overcoming obstacles to succeed in the end, which usually requires some sort of internal growth needed to succeed or to forgive someone, even. In romance, love conquers all. Soulmates, often the characters are meant to meet, or so they think. And very often you'll have this pattern of girl meets girl, boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl back. And it's a arc of redemption and forgiveness. So here's some more examples from Pixar movies. You might know some of these up here on the top. And look at how common all of these themes are. Let's take a look. A mismatched pair of partners with serious philosophical differences go on a wacky journey. Sound familiar? Well, that's, most of these films have that in common. Okay. And then it goes on. A child comes of age, a loved one is lost. These are very famous story beats and themes that we see repeated throughout movies because they're very common and they're very gratifying, and the audience finds watching characters experience this to be morally satisfying and cathartic. So let's go a little bit deeper. So Wolf of Wall Street has many themes, but one of them is crime does pay. Character practically seems to get away with it by the end. In 500 Days of Summer, maybe you've seen it, love is fickle. It doesn't work out for the character. Okay. And Don't Look Up, the world is run by idiots is one of the themes. In Get Out, racism is hidden. And in Goodfellas, Watch Your Back. Is anyone a fan of the TV show The Boys? It's making fun, it's parodying, making fun of superhero genre. It's got a little bit of a cynical approach, but it also has a major theme of daddy issues. Almost all the characters in the show have daddy issues, which is very interesting. So themes can be um, deeper or very obvious. So let's go a little bit deeper. Parasite, class warfare, immorality of the wealthy, criticism of capitalism. These are all deeper themes within Parasite. Joker, you might have seen it. Treatment of outcasts, mental illness in society, violence as expression. Okay, these are some of the deeper messages or ideas that are bouncing around in that movie. And usually deeper or more serious movies or more layered movies have deeper, more subtle themes if you look for them. Now, a simple child's movie is going to be a little bit more surface, learning life lessons, friendship, overcoming obstacles to succeed in the end. Those are a little bit more obvious. But a movie like Dune, a science fiction movie with a long history, we have coming of age, good versus evil, but also the oppressed rising up, a clash of cultures, and a messiah complex. Okay. So we're going to move on here, but just think about some of the themes in these movies. You may or may not have seen some of these films. What are the underlying messages? Love conquers all and West Side Story, good versus evil, but also messages of friendship and love lost. So think about those. We're going to move on and talk about genres. What type of story is it? So we've mentioned genre movies already, but we're going to get further into it. All right. So genre is a kind or type or style of film. A group of films with similar themes, plot, settings, and it's when you on your streaming service, you're going to have different genres: crime, action. That way the audience kind of knows what to expect. And most big budget Hollywood films are genre films. Oscar award-winning films tend to either be gender bending or genre bending type films, or they tend to be non-genre films. Okay, so here's your basic genre films: action, adventure, animation, family. You know most of these. Okay, these are pretty common and they're the most general, obvious genres. Okay, so here are the most common ones we see today. But of course, genres can have subgenres, getting a little bit more specific. So the heist film is a subgenre of thrillers, artist films, spy films, murder mysteries are a version of thrillers, but they're much more specific with a specific narrative structure. Action films can have disaster, martial arts, rogue hitman, very popular today. So moving on, we have some of the most popular genres over time, and you see that things have changed. So, for example, musicals and westerns have become much less popular in the modern age. These are kind of older genres that just don't resonate quite as much. Romance has dropped off a bit. War films also not so much. Action, plenty of those. Thrillers taken off. Sci-fi taking off. Comedy still doing well, and interestingly enough, documentary and fantasy also increasingly popular. And a lot of that has to do with sci-fi and fantasy. That has to do with the fact that now we have the CGI to realize those films in a much bigger way than we ever could before. So different combinations of genres, dark comedy. Alien is a combination of sci-fi and horror. And of course, you have zombie movies, which are just a particular genre of horror. You can combine different genres, different movies like Alien are combining drama, action, sci-fi, and horror. High Fidelity, which is a comedy, combines drama and comedy and romance. So, most films aren't perfectly one genre, but they're mixing, and that what makes them more interesting and kind of freshens up the story. Now, genres also go through various phases. Okay, so they change over time. They don't stay static because they're an art form, and art forms are evolving. So, in the early stages, we call it primitive, right? It's the early days. The genre forms, and there's experimentation. Okay, leading to sort of common tropes. All right. Now, in the classical phase, the tropes of a genre are defined, solidified, exalted. Now, what do I mean when I say tropes? Tropes are just common things that we see in a genre. So you're going to have warp drive in sci-fi, and you're going to have gunfights in a western. Things that the audience comes to expect. Now, in a revisionist genre, the tropes are challenged. They're modified to suit the times. Okay, so maybe by the time we get to revisionist phase, people are a little bit bored with the classical genre and they want something new. To keep the audience engaged, artists are always evolving in media, so they might revise it a little bit. And then finally, when people have seen enough of a genre, it turns to parody. Okay, you make fun of it. All right, and this is where we see films, silly films making fun of the tropes of a genre come out. So here we see the most popular genres in America. And, genre films have to progress or they stagnate. All right. And this is true of all music. I mean, rock and roll music changed and grew and progressed. And now it's fading a little bit, and electronic music is coming to the front. And the same thing will happen with that genre. So let's take a look at Western. So we have The Great Train Robbery, which is made like in 1904, one of the very first movies, The Primitive. Okay. Then we have High Noon, a classic Western with a showdown between the sheriff and his antagonist in the street. Okay, classic genre film with tropes that kind of set up the genre going forward. Then we have a revisionist film here where all the characters, including the hero, are kind of anti-heroes and they're all thieves. And there's no moral center to the film. It's a revisionist Western. Okay. And in the end, the film has a three-way shootout between the three characters. Then we have Blazing Saddles, which is a parody making fun of Westerns. Okay. So same thing happens with horror genre, primitive, psycho, classic, Halloween, revisionist Blair Witch Project, which was shot like an independent film, made to look like it was a documentary that never got made, and then Scary Movie, which is making fun of all the tropes, all the silly things that we see repeated in horror films. And by the way, this happens in rock and hip hop and music. You have early pioneers, it develops into a strong genre. Then you have some people that come along and kind of revise it or rebel. And then eventually people make fun of it, as we see with Weird Al Yankovic and Biz Markie. Comics, same thing. You have classic heroes, you have sort of revisionist heroes, and you have parody heroes. Okay. So let me clarify tropes and conventions. So a trope or a convention is a common theme, device, or situation in a film. Tropes are reused by directors because they're effective and they're familiar. So in a Western, one of the most common tropes is they're going to have a showdown, a shootout in the streets at high noon. Okay. And every genre has them, and the audience comes to expect them. Plus, they're hopefully exciting and interesting, but they can become overused, and that's when they become cliches. And that's what gets made fun of in a parody film. When something has been done enough, people get a little tired of it and they want to see a joke about it, which is kind of what The Boys, the television show The Boys, is all about. So, common tropes that we see in film. So, in horror films, there's almost always a scared woman, and they often call this the final girl. If there's a group of teenagers, the last one to survive is going to be one of the girls. And in films, you also often see a sinister hacker character is a very common trope we see in movies. In action films or spy films, you'll see the CIA control room where they have everyone on computers and they can instantly bring up information, and the boss is barking out orders. We see this in films like The Bourne Identity and so forth. Very common trope. So I want to hip you to a really cool show called, this is on Netflix, called Attack of the Hollywood Cliches. It's a fun little look at films. I really suggest you check it out on Netflix. And it explores all the various cliches and tropes of Hollywood. So horror, let's go a little bit deeper. You have fear of a dangerous world, revenge, parental abuse. We often see this. It's dark. There's bloody knives, spooky old shacks in the wood. Promiscuous teens die first. This is a real common device in horror. Jump scares. The villain escapes somehow, or his death is uncertain at the end of the film. You have the final girl. You have a stupid jock. You have the bitter weirdo outcast character. All very common tropes in those films. Tropes in action hero films. Good versus evil, friendship and working together, overcoming adversity to succeed in the end, sacrifice for greater good. So we see these repeated over and over, so we call them tropes. Battle your way to the boss, corny, tough guy banter. It's as they fight each other, they're going to have snappy lines, they're going to have time to do that. And of course, virtuous man of few words and diabolical genius. These characters are seen repeated over and over. Here's a couple more. We see beautiful people are good, ugly people are bad. Killing the boss will sometimes somehow end the conflict. If you just take off someone's glasses, they instantly become hot, and desirable. It always rains at funerals, and action heroes love to blow something up and walk away without looking at it. So just a couple examples of tropes, things you see repeated. Here's genres broken down by month. You'll see that certain things like thriller, suspense, and horror really do well in the orange months, or rather in October. That's the time for those types of films. Romance sometimes in February. Okay, let's move on to tone. Now, this is the most elusive concept that we'll discuss. It's sort of how a story feels and conveys the vibe. So tone has many elements. Could be the setting, the type of hero, the genre can set the tone, although genre films can have a multitude of different tones, as we'll see. Character, dialogue, and particularly humor will often set the tone. So in a screenplay, tone's the most elusive element. It doesn't necessarily have a physical form on the page, but emerges from between the lines as a mix of dialogue, structure, character, and narrative development. It manifests as a feeling rather than a tangible entity. Okay, so take a look at this example from Superman. You have the old Superman made back in the 80s when I was in school, and it was super bright. He was this really good guy. He didn't have any internal conflict, and the film reflected that visually. But then you move to the more modern Superman. His suit is much darker. The film is shot much more low key and dark, and it gives you an entirely different film. And really, he's a very internally conflicted character. So speaking of internally conflicted character, let's take a look at Batman. So the 1960s, you had it was just silly. It had look at the suit, and the whole tone of it was rather silly. In the 90s, the first movie Batman, it was much more dark surrealism. It had a dark tone, but it was much more of a fantasy. It looked like a big budget indie. In the 1990s, after Michael Keaton turned down the role, it went to campy sensationalism. They put nipples on the Batman's outfit here. Then we got to the Christian Bale and Christopher Nolan films, and we turned to a sort of a dark, brooding realism. Okay, look at the suit; it's much more materialistic. Militaristic, rather than this. This is much more idealistic. Okay, and then further on with the most recent Batman, the Robert Pattinson Batman, it's much more dark and gritty realism. It feels more like an independent film. Okay. The Batmobile looks much more realistic, like he could have actually built it himself. So, speaking about tone, I want you to think about the tone for your case study coming up with adaptation. It's a comedy drama. So, it's tone, it's comic, it's hopeful, but it's also cynical. There's a lot of absurdity and a touch of romanticism in it. It has a somewhat cynical look at Hollywood, business and story structure. So look out for that. And it really makes fun of a lot of Hollywood tropes, which we've just been talking about. So it has a lighter tone, but with a real heart and a classic hero's journey story structure to look out for. Okay. Okay. Talking about tone, think about different superhero movies. Deadpool is really silly and fun. So is Thor Ragnarok. Deadpool is always talking to camera, breaking the fourth wall, and making fun of the tropes of a superhero movie. It's very light. Okay. Logan, which was about Wolverine. Okay. I don't want to give you any spoilers alerts, but pretty dark, pretty heavy, much different tone. There's no comedy. There's a lot of violence in the film, and it received an R rating. They went for that. They wanted a darker tone for that character for that movie. 12 Years a Slave versus Django both deal with slavery, but they have very different tones. One is much more serious, tragic, and heavy with a major moral. The other is much more light and whimsical. It's a fantasy history. Okay. So here's a couple of different films to think about. They all have different types of tone. Any film with Ryan Reynolds is going to be a little bit whimsical because that's the kind of sarcastic actor that he is. Scott Pilgrim versus the World isn't a serious action film. It's a lighthearted comedy action film. Drive, however, is a pretty serious, heavy, darker toned crime film. La La Land is a romance film, but it's a little, it sort of defeats expectations by the end. So tone is slightly different. Here's some more films to think about. Power of the Dog, sort of a gothic, somber tone to that film. Inglourious Bastards, another war film, but with a more lighthearted approach. Much different than Saving Private Ryan, which is a very heavy, dramatic, and even tragic war film with a heavy, dark tone. Okay, now we're moving on to dialogue and screenwriting. Think about how your characters talk. How does a visual story told in writing? For screenwriting is very important part of filmmaking. It's one of the first things that happens. And just because someone has a dream to become a professional writer doesn't mean they have the talent to pull it off. The main reason most scripts fail is they haven't trained themselves. So we'll just give you a little basics here. First off, show, don't tell. It's number one rule. We don't want to explain things to the audience. We want to show them. So we show, don't tell. So with tell, you might say, she was my best friend. I could tell her almost anything. And then with the show example here, you illustrate it. Okay. You show the audience how much that relationship means rather than just telling them. Okay. So since the birth of cinema, it has been said to be a visual medium. Supposedly films must tell their story visually with lighting, camera movement, dazzling effects. Dialogue, on the other hand, is something we had to put up with. Okay. So the term film viewing, I went to see a film, doesn't even consider dialogue, but it's really important. And so how are we going to go from words to images? Okay. So what I'm illustrating here to you is an example from a script. This is from Harry Potter. So here's how the script is written. You have action descriptions and you have dialogue, which explain what is going to be filmed. And so in this scene, Harry's living under the stairs. Here's his evil cousin. And the descriptions and the way it's written leads to the visual. Okay. So screenwriting goals. What are you trying to do when you're writing a screenplay? The audience must care. Okay. If you don't make them care about the character, if you haven't made the characters identifiable, why are they going to spend 2 hours in the movie? Characters must have desires. They must have goals. Rising action, very important. Okay. The conflicts have to get harder on the way to the climax. It's important to see it from the audience's point of view. Never confuse or confound them. Remember, you're going to know your characters much more than the audience. And then, of course, show them something new. Entertain. That's the number one reason. So often you'll see symbolism in screenplays. RoboCop is like a Robo-Christ. The use of the color red in Schindler's List. Symbolism in lots of films. And these are very powerful storytelling tools and often help a script be stronger. You're going to see subtext. So the way the words are written, the characters don't come out and say exactly what they mean. So for example, in The Godfather, He says, I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse. Now, what he's saying is that if he doesn't do what you want him to do, I'm going to kill him. But that's a boring way to say it. This is a much more interesting way to say it that has subtext. Okay, in these two shots, when we see characters that are flirting with each other, very often that's in subtext. You don't come out and say, hey, I'm in love with you. I want to date you. Let's start right now. Well, that's a little bit scary. So there'll be a little bit of flirtation, a little bit of feeling out, and that's expressed in subtext, the hidden meaning behind the text. So there's lots of examples of memorable dialogue, and it must be written the way people talk. It must convey the necessary information, but it also is conveying hidden meaning. So, for example, this is from Pulp Fiction. Have you ever given a foot massage? Don't be telling me about foot massages. This is from the other character here. This is an example of dialogue that sounds the way people talk. It's whimsical and fun, even though it's not advancing the story. And the audience enjoys this. It's memorable. Dialogue by its very nature is deceptive. The characters on the screen speak not from their hearts, but from a script. They whisper secrets to a vast public. They speak to inform the audience, but not each other. That's the problem. Everybody understand? When you do this, you're doing something called sounding. If you fail and you mess this up, you start to sound like exposition, where the audience isn't talking like they normally would. They're talking to give you information. And when dialogue sounds like that, we say it's expository dialogue. And usually the audience doesn't like that because it's too obvious. So this is a real hangup for scriptwriters. They've got to write in such a way that it sounds the way people would normally talk in the situation, casual dialogue, but it also somehow advances the story and somehow conveys character. It's a delicate balance. Okay. So what do we want to do? We want to show, don't tell, and efficiency is important. You have 2 hours or less. Dialogue must be crisp, no wasted scenes or information. This is why you don't have long speeches in dialogue. It's usually crisp to get the idea across very colorfully and very quickly. Another thing to consider, character voice. Good dialogue gives character a unique voice. Character dialogue should be distinct and be consistent with the personality, education, and culture of the person. So Clint Eastwood says, go ahead, make my day. He's a cop, he's tough. It's something he would say. The Forrest Gump character says, life is like a box of chocolates. You know this quote. Not every character would say that. Clint Eastwood wouldn't say that. He's not that happy the way Forrest Gump is. So the dialogue has to come with a distinct character voice. So good dialogue advances the narrative subtly, shows us character, operates in a distinct character voice, has subtext and themes, could be clever and colorful, and it's suitable for the time and space. So for example, if the movie's set in the South, the characters gotta speak in the dialect of the South. Bad dialogue sounds like exposition. It confuses. There's an unclear character voice. There's characters saying things that don't seem like them. It's dull or corny or even worse, ordinary, and it's unsuitable for the time or place. So good screenplays. Consequences are better than coincidence. All right. Dialogue mistakes to avoid. Expository dialogue. Okay, unnatural sounding dialogue that is really exposition where the characters are saying something like, hey, let's go over there so we can fight the bad guy. Long speeches without interruption, repetition, preaching, or just plain ordinary words. Here's an example of some bad dialogue. I'll just leave this up for a second. I'm going to move on. You guys can stop now if you're curious. Here's some poetic dialogue from Blade Runner. Here's some really sharp, really well-written dialogue from David Mamet. I believe I included the video example of all of these in your optional videos if you want to take a look at these, but these are just some really great examples of dialogue that you can read on your own time. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears and talk about how we go from the written to the visual and actually how a screenplay is written. So question, how does Hollywood go from words on a page to a visual final product? And the answer is a script is written in such a way as to convey the visual information filmmakers need to envision the story. All right. So here in the example, what I'm showing you is the script is structured in such a way so it's conveying visual information. Exterior, lander. Brand turns away as the lander touches down in a spray of ice. Okay, so this is visual information that's being conveyed. And then down here we have the dialogue. Let's take a look. Screenplay has a bunch of different parts. And here's some terms to remember. Screenplay is what we call a script. It's a written out version of a film with dialogue and scene descriptions, locations, and screen direction. So a screenplay is more than just dialogue. It has visual information. That's the point I'm trying to make. You have narration, which might be off-screen commentary, scene headings, which gives us the time, a setting and time. We have off-screen. This is when anytime dialogue is off-screen, that's indicated with an OS. We have action, okay, that's character movements, and then parenthetical and transitions. Let's take a look more closely. So here we see a script, and these are the terms I've just gone over sort of applied. So up top, we have a screen heading. All right, it says interior, boys' bedroom, 1972. That's a lot of information. Over here, it says action. So here's what's going on. There are now many turtles in aquariums. So this is kind of setting up the scene. The boy in a turtle t-shirt looks out the window into the darkness. His eyes are troubled. Okay. Then we have a character's dialogue, mother, off screen. Okay. We have her dialogue here. And so all this information from the parentheticals to the scene headings to the action, you guys can take a look at this, is explaining what's going on visually. Okay. So in other words, the things that aren't expressed in dialogue, in addition to the dialogue, it's sort of painting the picture of the movie with just words. So parts of a script, we have scene heading, we have action, we have the character, and notice character and scene heading are capitalized. We have dialogue, we have parenthetical, which is sort of information for the character and the actor. And then we have transition, so how the scene changes between scenes. So going through it again, we have the scene heading, always capitalized. We have action. So what happens? Zach shivers. That's the action. We have the character. So this is for the actors. Those names are always capitalized, as you see here. This is what they say. And I want you to also notice it's centered to separate dialogue from action. Oops, I'll go back to that. So character name, then dialogue. All right. More examples. Notice that the dialogue is centered. Okay, character names capitalized, dialogue centered. That distinguishes it from scene headings and action. And this is a script is deliberately constructed this way so it can be useful to the most number of people. Okay, and even these blank spaces out here is often where actors and directors make their notes on a script. Okay, so once again, here's the whole thing. Scene headings and capitalized up here. Interior Oakland Coliseum batting cage, daytime. Okay, we have the various characters in their dialogue. We have some more action, all right? Actions are left justified and go between dialogue, all right? Scripts are formatted in a very precise way. They give information about the scene, the action, and the dialogue in a movie. So from the script, all the various talented individual people, the production designer, the director, the cinematographer, they have enough information that they can go about planning what they want to do. Okay, another example. Okay, and this example is actually from the film that we're going to watch. This is Adaptation. And now we're on to a review. Okay, today we talked about story elements. We covered hero types from superheroes to unlikely heroes to everyman heroes to anti-heroes. We talked about goals and conflict and how they're essential for a film. A character must have needs and wants. This leads to conflict and the various types of conflicts from internal to external. Remember, you have internal goals and you have external goals. You have internal conflicts with yourself and you have external conflicts with others and other forces. We talked about story arcs. This is the journey the character goes on in the film. They start in one place, they end in another. We have character arcs, okay, and how that changes over time. The character evolves. Other story elements we talked about: theme, the moral message of the film and the various themes. We talked about genre and the phases of genre and tropes and what those are, things we see used over and over again. And we talked about tone. Wrapping up, we moved on to dialogue and screenwriting. So we said show, don't tell, symbolism, subtext, good character voice. We defined what exposition is. We talked about script terms and script formatting, how it's laid out. Here's some examples from the lesson of that'll be good for you to study. So that brings us to the end of our lesson today. I'm going to stop my share, come back here. Say, hope that was interesting to you guys. Please reach out with any questions that you might have. We covered quite a lot of terms. Hopefully you were following along in your book. Those terms are all laid out there. You do have a quiz coming up. Hope you enjoyed the lesson, and please have a good day.